Hello, and welcome to HMR 1. We're almost at the end of our lectures on colonialism. This is the first of the three final. A week from today, as I noted during our initial conversation, we will be having our second midterm. And much of what I should mention, Aram and I needed to get away from it all and came down here to Sausalito, where my boat Mutara Nebula lives, and that's why you'll be hearing seagulls behind us. And the sun is setting, so I should move on. All right, so this is the beginning of our lecture on colonialism and its legacies and decolonization. And today's lecture looks primarily at the historical experience of Israelis and Palestinians in the context of the Israel-Palestine conflict and the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. So Palestine and Israel, the decolonization first of Palestine, then the creation of a new colonial settler state in the form of Israel. This process has all sorts of resonance, not with all other forms of colonialism, and including the historical experience of apartheid in South Africa, but also with the partition of India, in part because the British were also part of the equation here in Palestine and in Palestine prior to 1948, and also in Algeria, with the extraordinary amount of violence, and in particular, in the later years of the Palestine-Israel conflict, the role of religious difference in much of that conflict as well. So you'll be hearing resonance of all the elements of what we've looked at so far, and I really hope you had a chance to have a look at the Battle of Algiers over our short break, because much of the violence which has come to typify the Arab-Israeli conflict is not violence that occurs in the field of open battle, but rather violence in neighborhoods, attacks on not necessarily neighbor against neighbor, because the society has become so segregated, but the kind of violence that takes place on streets and in small communities and big cities. These are not great battles fought by great armies, but rather in the homes and the streets of regular people. So how's this crisis come about? So Palestine, where is it? It's in the Eastern Mediterranean. It was part of the Ottoman Empire up until 1918, when it was conquered by the British in the last months of World War I. Palestine was part of a larger province that also included cities like Beirut and Aleppo and Damascus. The nearest big city, the biggest city was called Jerusalem, which was, those of you who sort of know your religious history of Christianity and Judaism and Islam know that it's a very important pilgrimage city. But by and large, the area that made up the Ottoman province of Palestine was really not that important, and really a sort of a subunit of a much more prosperous and economically more important sort of subunit of a province its capital was in Damascus, in modern-day Syria. And at the time of the British conquest of Palestine in 1918, the first survey of the region showed that the population was overwhelmingly Christian and Muslim Arabic-speaking Jews, about 90% of the total population. The other 10% were made up of Christians and Muslims, right? I got that right. And then the rest of the population, about the rest of the sort of 10%, was made up of Arabic-speaking Jews, many of whom had lived in Palestine for centuries, others who had moved there at the time of the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in the 16th century. There were also large numbers of Circassians who had settled to work as border guards on behalf of the Ottoman Empire. They were refugees from a terrible genocide by the Russians in what is today the northern Caucasus. Then also Armenians who had settled there as well because of genocide in their homeland in Anatolia. And then the sort of tiny numbers of interesting Europeans who had moved there believing that the end was nigh and that they wanted to live nearer to Jerusalem to be first in line for the second coming of Christ. I make fun of it, I really shouldn't, but these were primarily Europeans who were motivated to settle in Palestine because it was the Holy Lands, and they established what were called millennial settlements in preparation for the end times. So, most people spoke Arabic. Most people had their origins in the Middle East. Palestine was integrated into the economic networks of trade of the Ottoman Empire. When the Ottoman Empire broke apart, a colonial regime was imposed on the entire region, with France taking over control of what is today Lebanon and Syria, and Great Britain taking over control of what is today Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq. So this was an era when there was seemed to be some urgency in dividing Arab states into these smaller states out of fear that they might become a mega state in many ways like India, that would be able to effectively challenge Western hegemony in the region. It was also, standard divide and conquer as practiced by the British as well in South Asia. So that's one part of the story. The other part of the story starts in Europe. European Jews, through almost the entire history from the Roman Empire forward, had faced periodic and often extremely violent episodes of pogroms, of massacres, of Jew hatred that had pushed Jews into a very subordinate and vulnerable position in much of European society. That evolved in the 19th century into a kind of ideology of Jew hatred that we call anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism is sort of a dressed up version of that hatred, but it finds its way into official bureaucratic regulations and the treatment of Jews within a modern society, sort of the categorizing of them as an other, as people without full access to rights. And so so as other Europeans were beginning to enjoy broader access to rights in the 19th century, and also were learning about sort of experimenting with very sort of secular approaches to ideas like citizenship, many Jews didn't believe that eventually, as these societies became more secular and became more democratic, that the kinds of violence and discrimination that they faced would actually end. It was, that there was nothing, they would always face this. And so the answer that one leading intellectual came up with at the time was that Jews should make their own state. And that this ideology is called Zionism. And what's interesting, Zion being one of the words for Israel. So the idea is that you would create an ideology or a nationalism for a people, but a people without an actual state within which to exercise that ideology. So this ideology proved actually not very popular at all to most European and American Jews. However, there was a sort of a strong following amongst a minority of European Jews who began the process of land purchase in Palestine, and it's accelerated in the 2 decades before before World War I, and then again accelerated in the period of the British occupation. So in other words, the Zionists, as a sort of a corporate group, were purchasing land in Palestine, often displacing Arab pastoralists and farmers in the process, and then beginning to create their own settlements in anticipation, perhaps, their ultimate goal was to create a state. So this process of settlement increased under the period of the British occupation, and it came to a real head in the 1930s when local Arab nationalists, fearing that they were losing their homeland to the Jewish settlers, attacked Jewish settlements, and there was a kind of a mini civil war, if you will, between Arabs and Jews in this period. And the British were, very concerned about this. This was making their rule very difficult, and they eventually put a ban on more Jewish settlement in Palestine. And this was actually at the very worst possible time to do that historically, as Jews in Europe, and by the late 1930s and into the 1940s, faced extermination as part of the Nazi plan to purify Europe of its Jewish inhabitants. So in the wake of the Second World War and the discovery of Hitler's plan, and the fact that he and his Nazis and allies across Europe had murdered over 6 million Jews, I think there was a great deal of sympathy for the idea that the Jews would not be able to really achieve safety in a world where such a thing could happen, and so therefore creating a Jewish state was imperative in order to protect worldwide Jewry, or the sort of world community of Jews. Now, this decision was taken. The UN, said we're going to support the creation. UN was founded in 1946. UN said we're going to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine, and Arabs weren't consulted on this particularly, and sort of a process of partition began to unfold. But this time, it wasn't done by the British. So the British actually throw their hands up, and they leave Palestine to the United Nations to settle the problem. And in this case, the United Nations, very similar to what happened in India, hired a map maker who went through and sort of based on some demographic realities that have been created by Jewish settlement over the preceding 50 years, awarded part of Palestine to the Jews and the other part of Palestine to Palestinian Arabs and Christians. And it also sort of turned Jerusalem into an international city under United Nations administration. In other words, sort of reserving it for the three faiths that saw it as an incredibly important and holy place. So that was rejected by all sides. The Arab armies, primarily of Abdullah in Jordan and the king of Egypt, they all attacked, thinking that they could win, and the nascent Israeli army was able to repel them, and Israel declared independence in April of 1948, which is also a day that's remembered as not just Israel Independence Day, but amongst Palestinians as a Nakba, the day of disaster, because this began their terrible journey of the last 3/4 of a century. So I want to focus now on two elements of this decolonization process, because it's not quite decolonization. Israel is a post-colonial state. Israel proper. It is sort of liberated, if you will, from British colonialism, and is a state which sees a sort of an equation between the inhabitants' identity and the borders of the state itself. So Israel is a decolonized state, post-colonial state, but Israel occupies and treats as a colony much of the remainder of historic Palestine, even though there's been the creation of an independent Palestinian state. So there's both decolonization and colonization at the same time. And if you're very interested in pursuing all of these issues, we teach several courses at UC Davis on the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I talk about it too in my Human Rights in the Middle East course, which I teach in alternate years. But I want to talk in the remainder of today's lecture about two critical human rights challenges embodied in the legacies of colonialism and decolonization. The first is refugees. The creation of the state of Israel at the same time created the Palestinian refugee crisis. So Israel is created, and in the creation of the state, many, if not most, of the Arabs, Palestinian Christians, and Muslims living in the territory that became Israel were pushed out. They either left of their own accord out of fear, or seeing that the Israeli units were committing massacres, or because they heard their own military commanders saying, leave and it'll be over in a bit. There are many different reasons why people left, but primarily because they were afraid. They're afraid they would be killed and their families killed, and so they fled. Some of them fled into what is today the West Bank, which is, if you take a look at the map, others fled into the Gaza Strip, while still others fled even further afield to what is today Jordan, Egypt, and to Lebanon and Syria. So almost half of all Palestinians, people who can trace their origins to Palestine, almost half of them around the world are refugees. Right? Many of them are living in the Gaza Strip. About 1.8 million who are registered with the UN live in Gaza. Another about almost 1 million registered refugees live in the West Bank. And then almost 3 million of those refugees live in Jordan. Jordan has the overwhelmingly largest number, is home to the overwhelmingly largest number of Palestinian refugees. Places like Syria, the Arab Gulf, also host large Palestinian refugee populations. Now, what's the human rights issue that faces refugees? And when we get to the next section, I hope to talk a little bit more about the modern refugee regime. But in this case, Palestinians are caught on the horns of a dilemma. Part of that dilemma is created by the reality that they have the right to return. Once a war is over, once peace has been established, refugees have a right to go home. It doesn't matter if a new state has been created. You know, they have a right to choose to go home or not go home. And so Palestinians have a right to return to what is today Israel. And the problem is, when Israelis think about that, they're very concerned. Right? You know, what kind of society would that create? Could it still be a Jewish state? And we'll talk about that in a second. Palestinians, if they were to return alongside the sort of 1.6 million or so Arab Israelis, as they're called, if they return, would constitute an extraordinarily large number of the existing Israeli population and really change the demographics of it. So that's one issue, that they're being denied their right to go home. And then, because they're refugees, and we're talking about multi-generations of refugees, so very, very few of the refugees living today were adults in 1948 when the State of Israel was created. In other words, most of the refugees that we're talking about today, it was their grandparents or even great-grandparents who fled Palestine to places like Syria or Lebanon. And in places like Syria and Lebanon, refugees are not considered citizens. They don't have citizenship rights. In fact, they don't have very many rights at all, and this creates terrible vulnerabilities for them. Lebanon is perhaps the worst. I mean, those of you who are familiar with, say, the treatment of, say, people on work visas in the United States, it's similar to that, but without any, even the basic protections that a work visa might produce. Jordan is another issue where Palestinians often receive full citizenship as part of, because in Jordan, the population is overwhelmingly Palestinian origin. So this is one of these continuing legacies, is this sort of open wound of Palestinian refugee status. The other issue to think about is just do some numbers here. So Israel controls the lives of about 4.5 million Palestinians. Now, after the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, which led to the creation of an independent Palestinian state, there was great hope that Israelis and Palestinians could sort of live side by side in two independent states. But in the successive, 30 years, Israeli policy has really been not to support an Israeli state, a Palestinian state, but rather to undermine its independence and create a situation where it's destabilized, but also to slowly but surely take over parts of Palestine itself and turn it over to Israeli settlers to build new communities, dividing Palestine into what now, and you can take a look at the map, is really a series of islands that are not contiguous, but are only connected by roads, which could be very easily cut off by Israeli soldiers, and often for Palestinians to travel between one part of Palestine and another, they must pass through Israeli manned checkpoints. So in other words, they don't really have the freedom of travel or the kinds of sovereignty that one would expect to find if it was an actual independent state. I often see great parallels between the denial of actual sovereignty to Palestinians and the way that the United States has historically treated tribal nations in the United States, the kinds of indigenous national communities of the first peoples of North and South America as well. So Israel really is the colonial power dominating the lives of all these Palestinians, right? Often, restricting their ability to travel, they're restricting their ability to find work, especially in Israel proper, making it very difficult for them to come and go. I was involved many years ago in trying to bring a group of Fulbright scholars from Gaza to the United States, and the Israeli government wouldn't give them exit visas, even though they were leaving their own sovereign state. There was no airport in Gaza, so if they wanted to fly to the United States, either they had to travel somehow to Egypt, and that wasn't happening, or they had to, we're having my fisherman neighbor is parking his boat. Either they could travel to Egypt to try to fly out, and that wasn't going to happen, or they could go to Ben Gurion Airport outside of Tel Aviv, and the Israelis were forbidding their exit. I mean, some of this just seems like just such meanness as well. So this is the question that I want to end today's lecture on, and I would like you all to see that today's lecture is under 30 minutes, which I think is wonderful. Can democracy and colonialism coexist? In other words, can a democratic state be a colonial state? Can it have colonies? Can it create two tiers of citizenship? Those who are real citizens and those who aren't. And the other question to ask is, should modern states be based upon a religious identity? And people will argue whether or not the idea of the Jew is a religious identity, or is a national identity, or is an ethnic identity. But certainly part of it is religious. And so the question is, are states based on religion really ones that can promote and defend human rights? So the ongoing conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis, in addition to these critical human rights legacies in the multi-generational permanent displacement of Palestinian refugees, and this sort of ethical, moral, and political conundrum of, can you be a democracy and a colonial state at the same time? Dude just couldn't park his boat, man. What's going on over there? Can you be a democracy and a colonial state at the same time? It's also been destabilizing. Israel and its neighbors have gone to war several times since 1948. It sort of created, in order to confront Israel, the Palestinians created a military wing, the Palestine Liberation Organization's army. And still, while there is less violence today than there was in the past, that lack of violence has only been achieved by the fact that Israel has built this wall of separation that, as far as Palestinians are concerned, is the equivalent of the wall of a prison. So, in years past, we read Joe Sacco's wonderful graphic novel, Palestine, which would be a wonderful introduction to this issue if any of you are interested. Also, again, we do teach both in the Human Rights Studies program, in the context of human rights in the Middle East, the the Palestine-Israel conflict, and as well as in history, our modern history courses, and Zev Moaz in poli-sci, although he's quite old school, teaches in this field as well. So thank you, and I look forward to our questions.